So, the Phoenix Suns, who were just a few months removed from making a finals appearance, lost in the second round to the Dallas Mavericks, and they did so in historically embarrassing fashion. Now, of course, with such a huge upset, there are a lot of things that many people could look at, such as Luka Doncic and his potential all-time great postseason run, or what exactly should the Phoenix Suns do next in hopes that this doesn't happen again so they can possibly go back to the finals, especially because DeAndre Ayton in this upcoming offseason is due for a contract extension, and with Phoenix already well over the books financially, are they willing to commit to a center that didn't look all that impressive throughout this series? And if they decide to move away from their 23-year-old center, who exactly is going to dance with Cameron Payne before the games? So yeah, a lot of very important questions that need to be answered as soon as possible. But the one thing that the NBA community has decided to focus on heavily is Chris Paul and his playoff history. Because if you didn't know, another reason why this is such an embarrassing loss for the Phoenix Suns is because in the beginning of the series, they were up 2-0. And with the result of the series being a loss, this makes the 5th time in Chris Paul's career where he's blown a 2-0 lead. And with that being an undeniable fact, many people are starting to throw around the phrase playoff choker when talking about CP3. And honestly, as much as I love Chris Paul, when I look at his resume, it looks pretty disturbing on the surface. Not only does he have 5 blown 2-0 leads, but also he has a blown 2-1 lead, he has a blown 3-2 lead, he has some unforgiving moments during a 2014 series against the Oklahoma City Thunder, and of course, as we all know, he infamously participated in blowing a 3-1 lead as well. So yeah, Chris Paul, playoff choker, makes a lot of sense, right? Well, not so much, because in these series, Chris Paul as an individual is normally putting up really good numbers. He, as well as his teammates, have dealt with injuries and unfavorable moments. And when you look at some of the teams that he ended up losing to, honestly, I don't know how much of a choke job you can label it if he wasn't even favored to win the series to begin with. So in today's video, we're going to dig a little bit deeper, look at Chris Paul's playoff career, his shortcomings, and figure out if he is truly a playoff choker. We'll begin in 2008 in the Western Conference semifinals, where 23-year-old Chris Paul has the tall task of leading the Hornets past the dynastic San Antonio Spurs, a Spurs team that was fresh off of a championship run and also had the 4th best odds to repeat that year. So yeah, for whatever reason, people try to be critical of CP3 not beating this team. Nevertheless, after the first 2 games of the series, the Hornets had a 2-0 lead, and in both of those games, CP3 was amazing. Which then brings us to Game 3, where CP3 elevated his play to all-time heights and was not only the best player on the floor that game, but also gave us iconic moments in which you probably have seen to really capture how great the future Hall of Famer was in his prime. However, even with a 35-point outing with 9 assists, only 1 turnover, and shot 60% from the field, it just wasn't enough to beat the Spurs as the Hornets lost by 11 points. I went back to watch this game to try to figure out why exactly did the Hornets lose, and it was a combination of Stojakovic and Pargo having horrible shooting nights, as well as the backcourt of Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili being way too much to handle for the Hornets defense. For the next 3 games, the Hornets and Spurs would alternate decisive victories. And yes, I went back to go look at the 2 losses, and no, Chris Paul did not play bad in either one of them. The biggest reason why they lost those 2 games is because David West struggled immensely to score, but it's David West against the San Antonio Spurs defense that's being anchored by Tim Duncan. Honestly, I shouldn't even have to break this series down to you, but I'm going to do it just to be thorough. Which then brings us to Game 7. Now on the surface, Chris Paul, statistically speaking, looks pretty good. 18 points, 14 assists, 5 steals, and shot respectable from the field. However, even with those numbers, there is a moment in this game that is up for question. With roughly 50 seconds left to go in the game, the Spurs only have a 5-point lead and the Hornets have the ball. Out of the timeout, Chris Paul inbounds the ball but receives it right back, gets a screen from David West, and is in full attack to the rim but unfortunately misses the layup. And when you look back at the replay, it certainly looks makeable. So in theory, if CP3 made that layup, then the Spurs lead would get trimmed down to 3 points. On the other side of the floor, the Hornets would just have to make a stop, which would then give the ball back to the Hornets with the potential of tying the game and sending it to overtime. Now, all of that sounds great in theory, and realistically speaking, you can be critical of Chris Paul missing that layup. However, there's no realistic indications that the Hornets would have won this series even if CP3 made that layup. And the reason why I said it is because how the Spurs were defending Chris Paul and how Chris Paul's teammates were just missing their shots. because in many late game situations, the Spurs were either hedging off of a screen or sometimes even sending a double, forcing Chris Paul to pass to an open player, and for the most part, his teammates were just missing shots. In particular, in that game 7, Stojakovic and Peterson shot a combined 5 for 18 from the field and 2 for 9 from deep, and looking at it through an even wider lens, in the last 5 games of that series, Jannero Pargo, Morris Peterson, and Peja Stojakovic all shot horrible from the field. Now couple that information with the fact that David West was also struggling throughout this series, and it becomes nearly impossible for me to be extremely critical of Chris Paul even with that missed layup, and this is certainly a far stretch from a choke job. Also, and I can't believe I have to say this, bro, Chris Paul being able to force a game 7 against the San Antonio Spurs with spotty shooting performances from his teammates should speak volumes to how great he was all throughout this series, and yes, he was undeniably the best player on the court for either teams. Now let's fast forward to 2013, where Chris Paul is now playing for the Los Angeles Clippers, and the Clippers are matched up against the Memphis Grizzlies. Now before the series started, I looked into it, and neither one of these teams were heavily favored, nor were they heavily favored to go on to win a championship, so this is a relatively even matchup. And because of this, on the surface, it does come across as a bit unbearing that despite Chris Paul's amazing play in the first 2 games in the series that helped the Clippers have a 2-0 lead against the Grizzlies, that he would go on and blow that 2-0 lead as the Grizzlies would win the next 4 games. To make it even more eye-opening, CP played horrible in game 3 as well. But of course, everything isn't that simple, because before game 5, Blake Griffin awkwardly landed on Lamar Odom's foot during practice, which left him hampered for the remainder of the series. Actually, Griffin was so compromised that in game 6, he had to come off the bench. And what was even more revealing is that in those 2 games, the Clippers still lost despite the fact that Chris Paul production, especially in terms of scoring, increased significantly to a 30-point score on great efficiency. So, even though yes, this is one of the series where Chris Paul did blow a 2-0 lead, it's completely unfair to be heavily critical of him, not only because Blake Griffin went down after game 4, but also in the final 2 games of the series when they needed more production out of Chris Paul, he gave it to them. Now, everything doesn't look so positive for Chris Paul in these upcoming series, as we now jump 1 year forward to the 2014 Western Conference semifinals, where the Clippers matched up against the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now, even though yes, when the series was all said and done, statistically speaking, Chris Paul looked great, and on top of that, the Thunder were the favorite team in the series, so they were supposed to win. And on top of that, outside of the Clippers upsetting the Thunder after game 1, there really was no significant lead for CP3 to blow throughout this series. However, this series is still worth noting when talking about Chris Paul's postseason failures, because even with all of those factors, this series was still winnable, but the only reason why they ended up losing it is because of Chris Paul's poor performances. In game 2, Chris Paul got into early foul trouble in the first quarter, which allowed OKC to build a 9-point lead that they held on to throughout the rest of the game. In game 3, Chris Paul would go 0 for 4 in the final period, and mind you, the Clippers were actually leading in that fourth quarter, but still dropped the ball down the stretch. But the biggest meltdown of them all has to be the infamous game 5. Where Chris Paul, in a game where the Clippers had a 1-point lead with less than 20 seconds left to go, instead of just taking the foul and getting sent to the free throw line, he proceeds to shoot a shot, believing that he's having a high IQ moment so Westbrook can foul him and hopefully he can be sent to the free throw line for 3 free throws instead of 2, but instead turns the ball over. Then in the following possession, he ironically fouls Westbrook as he attempts a 3-pointer, sending Russ to the free throw line. Then he makes all 3 of his, thus giving OKC the 1-point lead. Then in the final possession, where Chris Paul has the ability to right all of his wrongs by making the game-winning shot, he then turns the ball over, thus cementing an OKC 1-point victory. So yeah, really bad from Chris Paul, and that's the definition of choking away a series. So yeah, definitely have no problem calling it like it is. And just a quick side note, when I was rewatching this game, bro, Doc Rivers was perplexed to what Chris Paul was doing. Oh, and then he just defaults to yelling at the referees because they should have called a foul, and it's like, bro, Doc, quit the act, dog, just quit it. Now we move on to the 2015 Western Conference semifinals, where the Clippers matched up with the Houston Rockets, and yes, this is a series where they infamously blew a 3-1 lead. Now, I know for a fact most people probably believe that this is a no-brainer for Chris Paul blowing yet again another lead. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Actually, it's so complicated that I made an entire video, so I highly suggest you checking it out. However, here are the footnotes. Chris Paul entered the series dealing with a hamstring injury that was so severe that he missed the first 2 games. And then even when he came back and the series was shifted back to LA, he still didn't perform that well. However, the Clippers straight up annihilated the Houston Rockets, giving them the 3-1 lead. So now that you know that Chris Paul was absent for the first loss in the series, it now allows us to focus on the last 3 losses. And in games 5 and 7, CP3 was great, and unfortunately, the score wasn't close enough for me to do any deep dive looking into the fourth quarter, which then brings us to game 6, where more or less Chris Paul is still playing great within the first 3 quarters of this game, but then the fourth quarter arises. And in that final period, a quarter in which the Rockets were down by 13 points, CP3 would then proceed to shoot 2 for 7 from the field as he participated in a massive collapse from the Los Angeles Clippers. And it's also very important to note that out of those last 3 losses, this was easily the most winnable game for the Clippers. So I can see why many people highlight this series in terms of CP3's collapses in the postseason. However, it's really hard for me to blame an entire series on Chris Paul just because of one bad quarter. Though it was a very important one, there were still other factors that played a much bigger role in determining the outcome of this series, such as Corey Brewer and Josh Smith going bonkers, combining for 29 points in an exact same quarter as they had the game of their lives. But more importantly, the supporting cast members surrounding Chris Paul and Blake Griffin throughout those last 3 losses were bad. Like really bad. And I know some people find it to be an excuse to highlight role players in a series loss. However, when you look at these shooting splits from JJ Redick, Matt Barnes, Jamal Crawford, and Austin Rivers, honestly, I don't know what else you can expect from Chris Paul. And I do not subscribe to the ideology of, well, you're a great player, so you should just figure it out. I believe that's a very idiotic and Neanderthal way to look at basketball because, I mean, honestly, what do you want? What do you want Chris Paul to start making shots for JJ Redick? I don't understand that. So this is a bit of a toss-up, and I'm going to allow you to determine who exactly is the reason why the Clippers blew a 3-1 lead during this series. Now, moving forward, a lot of these other series are pretty self-explanatory. In 2016, it seems like Chris Paul blew a 2-0 lead against the Portland Trail Blazers. However, if you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that Blake Griffin and CP3 were injured in this series as Chris Paul fractured his hands. Then in 2017, Chris Paul blew a 2-1 lead against the Utah Jazz. However, at the end of Game 3, Blake Griffin sustained a big toe injury that kept him sidelined for the remainder of the series. Then moving on to the following season as CP now plays for the Houston Rockets, and he blew a 3-2 lead against a Warriors team that they had no business at all competing with. However, once more, it's unfair to be critical of Chris Paul here because he dealt with a hamstring injury that kept him sidelined for the last 2 games of this series. And then that brings us to last year's NBA Finals, where for whatever reason, people are extremely critical of Chris Paul, but I honestly don't know why. After being up 2-0, the Suns would go on to lose Game 3. A lot of people tend to forget in that game, Devin Booker played so poorly that his coach had to put him on the bench. So I don't see how that's Chris Paul's fault. But then Chris Paul had one of the worst games of his entire career in Game 4. And to make it even worse, he basically had a game-deciding turnover at the end of the fourth quarter. So yeah, definitely can put all the blame on him in that game. But then in Game 5, Chris Paul made it up. He was amazing, putting up 21 points, 11 assists, shot 60% from the field. And specifically in the fourth quarter in a close game, he went perfect from the field, perfect from behind the arc. And when you take into consideration the amount of points that he scored, the points that were generated from his assists, and him passing the ball to Ayton that translated to a free throw, Chris Paul in some way essentially was responsible for 20 of the 29 points that the Suns scored in that fourth quarter. So yeah, can't blame him there. And if anything, if you want to blame somebody, I guess it would have to be Devin Booker, as he had a late game turnover that essentially sealed the deal for the Bucks in that game. And then we have Game 6, where once again, Chris Paul plays great. 26 points, 5 assists, shot nearly 58% from the field. And in particular, in the fourth quarter of a close game, Chris Paul basically goes perfect from the field and went 3 for 4 from the free throw line with 9 points and only 1 turnover. So yeah, I don't know how anybody could blame Chris Paul for losing this series. In all honesty, in my opinion, this was a great series from both teams, and it just so happened that the Bucks had the better player, so they went on to win. However, if you had to blame somebody, honestly, it might have to be Devin Booker. Once more, not only did he play so bad in Game 3 that he got benched, then had a late game turnover in Game 5, but in particular, in the final game of this series, Devin Booker was held to 19 points on 36% shooting from the field, turned the ball over 6 times, 5 of those turnovers happened in the second half, and in the fourth quarter, Devin Booker shot 2 for 7 from the field. And then finally, we have this year's Suns and Mavericks series where Chris Paul will play amazing in the first 2 outings, giving his team a 2-0 lead, but then after that, Chris Paul fell off the face of this earth. You can call it age or a really bad matchup, but regardless, CP was horrible. He was held under 10 points routinely and couldn't buy a basket in Game 6 while the Mavericks were blowing the Phoenix Suns out by nearly 50 points. But is that enough to consider Chris Paul a playoff choker? In this video, we discussed 9 different series where Chris Paul will go on to lose despite the fact that his team was the first to reach 2 wins in the series. And out of the 9, there's only 2 series where Chris Paul performed so badly where we could put the bulk of the blame in his lap. However, for the 9 series, you could easily just chalk up to injuries in 2013, 16, 17, and 18. And then in 2 series, you could easily just argue that Chris Paul lost to the better team in 2008 against the San Antonio Spurs and in the 2021 NBA Finals against the Milwaukee Bucks. And then we had the 2015 series where, again, I said I'll leave it up to your discretion. Me personally, it falls somewhere in the middle. But even if I were to edge it a little bit closer to blaming Chris Paul, it's still just not enough. Out of these 9 series, calling Chris Paul a playoff choker basically based off of 2 series and 1 bad fourth quarter is not enough to justify that labeling. Furthermore, it's really hard for me to overlook the fact how great Chris Paul just performs in the playoffs in general. He's one of the very few players in NBA history where his regular season production carries over into the postseason, and even through a more refined lens at looking at what Chris Paul produces in closeout games, even that is better than what CP produces in a regular season, which again speaks volumes to how great of a postseason performer he is. Look, when throwing around the label playoff choker, I believe that we have to be a little bit more complex in the conversations that we have than just he choked because he blew this lead or he choked because he has not yet won a championship. And I do believe that's where Chris Paul falls victim to. It's the same low-level ideology that people use to criticize LeBron for losing in the finals, even though he wasn't favored, and on top of that, he played great. So for anybody to be heavily critical of CP3 for losing a series where he averaged 24, 11, and 2.5 steals while shooting 50% from the field, and you're being critical of him because he lost a series, even though it's against the San Antonio Spurs, is a bit ridiculous. And on top of that, it's very disingenuous when people just throw up how many leads that he's blown without putting into proper context that some of these series he or Blake Griffin didn't even finish. So yeah, Chris Paul is far from a playoff choker, and honestly, I just think we should evolve the dialogue around playoff performers, especially those who may not have won a championship yet. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below about CP3's postseason career. Also, for the people out there who are interested in the video where I talk about the Clippers blowing that 3-1 lead back in 2015, make sure you click the video on the screen right now and make sure you hit the subscribe button and notification bell. Until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.